What's going on, everybody? Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the West Division Semi-Final between the BC Lions and the Calgary Stampeders by the numbers to see who has the edge in this matchup. So BC and Calgary met 3 times this year, with the BC Lions winning the first 2 matchups, but of course 2 weeks ago, Calgary went into BC Place and won 41-16. So the first matchup was actually week 1 of this season, was actually the opening game of this CFL season. BC wins 25-15 at Calgary in what was a very convincing game, much more convincing than what the final score will tell you. I thought it was really a dominant performance by the BC Lions in that week 1 matchup, and you just started to see the gap develop between these two teams. And then they don't meet again until week 10 of this season, where the BC Lions again win 37-9, this time at BC Place. A very convincing win. This one much more reflective of the gap between these two teams, and Calgary really didn't get anything going offensively throughout that entire matchup. And then in week 20, like I said, Calgary goes in there a couple of weeks ago and really shocks the Lions, and ultimately this is the win that gets them into this playoff game here, 41-16 at BC Place. And you really saw the Stampeders of last year show up with, the running game really playing a big role, and the defense stepping up and making some timely plays. So ultimately BC wins the season series this year 2-1 over Calgary, but I still think that BC overall is the better team just based on what we've seen between these two teams this year. Now, looking at the quarterback matchup for this one, Jake Maier, 18 games played, 4,237 passing yards, 19 touchdowns, 16 interceptions, and completing 63% of his passes this season. Very disappointing year from Jake Maier. I really thought he was going to take that next step and become one of these upper echelon quarterbacks in the CFL, but unfortunately that didn't happen. There's some external factors that I think have played a role in Jake Maier's disappointing season, like the play calling and the injuries to the receivers, but I think at the end of the day, Jake Maier has not played up to expectations this season, but overall he still just got them into the playoffs here and ultimately continues that 18th year playoff streak for the Stampeders. Now, for Vernon Adams on the BC side, he played 16 games this year. Technically, he played 18 games, but I put 16 games on the board because he didn't play in 2 of those games. He was just dressed as a backup, an emergency backup. So 16 games played, 4,769 passing yards, 31 touchdowns versus 18 interceptions for 68% completion percentage. Just a really strong season from Vernon Adams this year. Really had big shoes to fill with Nathan Rourke going to the NFL in the season that he put up last year for BC. So I thought that Adams did a really good job stepping into this offense. He had some bad games. Obviously, that one against Toronto, everybody's going to point to with the 6 interceptions. But also that game against Ottawa a few weeks ago where he threw 3 interceptions. So there were some bad games in there, and he did not look good against that Stampeders defense the last time we saw them out there. But ultimately, that game, BC did not have the proper motivation, I think, going into that matchup, because they basically were set in second place in the West, even though they technically had a shot at first place in the West if Winnipeg lost their last 2 games. But I think at the end of the day, Vernon Adams has had a really strong season for the BC Lions this year and deserves a lot of credit for what he's done for this team. So that is the quarterback matchup. Let's take a look at this team's stats for this season. So in terms of points per game, the BC Lions have the edge here, 27.5 points per game, which is 3rd in the CFL. It really looked like at the beginning of the season, this is a type of team that would lead the league in scoring, but they kind of slowed down towards the second half of the season and finished 3rd in that category. Calgary, on the other hand, 22.9 points per game, which is 6th in the CFL. Just kind of a disappointing season for them. Like I said, offense, I think, is the primary culprit of that. I think that they really didn't generate enough big plays, and I think that really cost them in a lot of games this year. So I think that when you look at it, the statistical difference between those two teams, it's really only like 4 points. But I think at the end of the day, you haven't seen the explosiveness from Calgary that you have seen with BC and those great receivers that BC has over there. Calgary really only has that one reliable target in Reggie Bagleton. Now, in terms of points against per game, BC has the edge here, 24.4 points allowed per game, which is 4th in the CFL. And again, BC started out the season looking like the best defense in the CFL. They were being called the Donut Boys, self-proclaimed Donut Boys, with a couple of shutouts versus Edmonton, but at the end of the day, they kind of slumped down the stretch. We're actually kind of an average to below average CFL defense down the stretch, giving up some 30-point games and whatnot. So they slide in the rankings to 4th in points allowed per game this year, but at the end of the day, still a very strong defense overall when you look at the body of work on the season. And then for Calgary, it's 26.2 points per game, which is 6th in the CFL. So not too bad for Calgary on the defensive side when you look at the totality of their season, but overall, I think that is kind of misleading. They've had some games where they have not performed up to snub on the defensive side as well. So, I mean, Calgary just kind of an underwhelming team on both sides of the ball this year, but they are playing their best football the last month or so of the CFL season. Now, in terms of passing offense, BC has a big edge here, 295.3 yards per game through the air, which is 1st in the entire CFL. Very much a pass-heavy team in British Columbia. And then for Calgary, it's 223.9 yards per game through the air, which is 7th in the CFL. I think Calgary's looked better offensively throughout the last couple of months. Jake Maier has cleaned up some of those turnover issues that has plagued his season, the first half of the season, that is. But I think at the end of the day, it's still not reflected in terms of the yards per game. They're really not moving the ball as efficiently as other teams, especially BC, through the air. Now, in terms of rushing offense, this is one that Calgary actually has the edge here. 98.3 yards per game on the ground, which is 6th in the CFL. Still a little bit of an underwhelming number for me because the last couple of years, Calgary was the #1 rushing team in all of the CFL, so they've taken a massive step back this year in that regard. Kadeem Carey being in and out of the lineup a lot of this season. Dedrick Mills, a capable running back, but he kind of had some big games and then kind of disappeared. So I think at the end of the day, Calgary, that's still the key to their offense, is running the football. We saw that a couple weeks ago in BC. They kind of rediscovered that, but overall in the season, a very low-ranking rush offense from what I expected. And then for BC, on the other hand, speaking of low-ranking rush offenses, they actually ranked last in the CFL in rushing this year, 77.8 yards per game on the ground for the BC Lions this year. So passing is really BC's bread and butter, and they really rely on that. If they get into a situation where they have to run the ball and close out games, I think that this is somewhere that the BC Lions kind of struggle. Now, in terms of the defensive side of things, for passing defense, the Stampeders have the edge here, 227.3 yards per game allowed through the air, which is 3rd in the CFL, whereas the Lions are slightly worse, 230.5 yards allowed per game through the air, which is 4th in the CFL. So very similar in terms of passing defense there. And then on the rushing defense side of things, this is where you see a big gap between these two teams. Calgary allows 124.8 yards per game on the ground, which is 8th in the CFL. That is a staggering number. So BC doesn't really have the offense to take advantage of that relatively weak Calgary Stampeders run defense. So it'll be interesting to see if BC gets up to a big lead in this game. Can they effectively run the ball against that Calgary run defense that has struggled throughout this season? But at the end of the day, the statistics tell you that BC does not have the running game that's capable of taking advantage of that. Now, in terms of the BC Lions rushing defense, they're 4th in the CFL, allowing 99 yards per game even. So they've had a pretty good running defense throughout the season, pretty good defense overall throughout the season. They actually ranked 4th in points against, 4th in pass defense, and 4th in rush defense. But that's kind of disappointing considering where they were at the beginning of the season. Like I said, looking like the best defense in the CFL. So they've definitely cooled down throughout the season. So it'll be interesting to see how they play against Calgary on Saturday at home. So in terms of the matchups that I'm watching for in this one, I've highlighted 3. Mike Rose, defensive tackle for the Calgary Stampeders against that BC Lions offensive line. I think we saw the Lions, the Stampeders, use a lot of 3-man pressure against the Lions and kind of drop a lot of guys into coverage. But the Stampeders have a couple of difference makers on that defensive line that can get through with just a 3-man rush. And one of those guys is Mike Rose, who I still consider the best defensive tackle in the CFL. Just the consistent effort that he puts out. I think he had 10 sacks on the year, so the production is there as well. So I'm interested to see if he makes a big play or two in this game against BC's offensive line. Now, the second matchup I have on the board here is one that everybody is talking about going into this matchup, and that is running backs Kadeem Carey and Peyton Logan, versus BC's front seven. And BC's a little bit light in the front seven. You saw that a couple of weeks ago where Calgary was able to pound the ball repeatedly down the throat of the BC Lions defense, and BC just wasn't able to stop them. So I think that if Calgary can keep the running game involved, keep this a close game throughout this game, and use the running game to their advantage, this is an advantage that Calgary definitely could exploit in this matchup. Now, the last one I have on the board here is kind of a weird one, and that is Vernon Adams versus himself. I think that Vernon obviously has had some great games this year. Mostly it's been great. I think he's had a really strong season, and you could argue he should have been the West Division MOP this year, but I think at the end of the day, he is still capable of those dud games, and I think at the end of the day, I'm excited to see if he has one of those in this matchup. I think that Calgary definitely threw some interesting wrinkles defensively, like I said, with the three-man rush, dropping a lot of guys into coverage and taking away those initial reads for Vernon Adams. So I'm excited to see how it turns out in this matchup. I think that Vernon Adams has the tendency to have some of those high turnover games. So if Calgary can grab a couple of those turnovers in this game, I think that they have a very good shot of upsetting the BC Lions at BC Place on Saturday evening. So with that said, that is going to be the end of today's short game preview for this weekend's West Semi-Final between the BC Lions and the Calgary Stampeders. Be sure to let me know your thoughts and who do you think wins in the comment section. And with that said, hope you guys enjoy the games this weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.